Does the sound of the building? It's very old.
Because he insists on fixing everything himself.
Wanda, please.
What apartment number is it? It's up here.
Second floor.
Please go back to your apartments. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me? It's LAPD.
Ma'am, open up the door, please.
Say that she lives alone. She's not very social.
I need to get back where the police.
Ma'am, we're the police.
Just calm down.
Hey guys, what's happening? Niyat here with Film Comics Explained, and as requested, today we'll be exploring the 2008 horror film Quarantine, directed by John Eric Dowdle, starring Jennifer Carpenter, Jay Hernandez, Columbus Short, and Steve Harris. A direct remake of the 2007 Spanish horror film Wreck, Quarantine follows a news reporter, a cameraman, and two firefighters that had been tasked with shadowing who find themselves trapped inside a building that was being quarantined by the CDC. While the cause for the quarantine is not initially known, we'd soon come to discover that there was a virus circulating among the residents of the building, which turned them into feral zombie-like beings that desired to spread the infection to others. This virus was essentially a form of rabies that was stolen from a bioweapons lab by a doomsday cult. Wanting to bring the world to its knees, the cult began re-engineering it into a deadlier strain, which they dubbed the Armageddon virus. Though they planned on releasing the virus in their manifesto to the public in a coordinated attack, a breakdown in containment procedures where the virus was being worked on led to some of the cult members becoming infected. This in turn had a cascading effect, with many of the residents in the building eventually coming into direct contact with it.
Tell us, Bob, what's a normal night here at the station?
Well, this might surprise most people, but 85% of the calls we go out on are medical. It can be anything from chest pain to more serious things.
After the critical success of Wreck, Sony Pictures and Screen Gems began discussing the viability of doing an American remake, given the fact that the small Spanish film wasn't able to reach the international audience it deserved. Filmmaking duo John Eric Dowdle and Drew Dowdle were then hired to write and direct the remake a few months after the release of Wreck. Once the brothers had written their treatment and had it approved by the studios, the pair began casting the principal characters over the next few weeks. Wanting to capture the claustrophobic atmosphere of an old apartment building and desiring to have the adequate space and equipment necessary to facilitate the shoot, the production team opted to build a massive 40-foot set of a 1930s style building under the direction of production designer Gary Steele. This gigantic structure housed numerous rooms and had 4 levels, enabling the crew to shoot the characters sinuously moving up and down the stairs without needing to cut. Once the set had been completed, principal photography began at the end of February, a few days after the characters were cast, and wrapped up after 26 excruciatingly long shooting days. Much to my surprise, instead of shooting the film out of sequence, every scene was shot in chronological order. This is usually a nightmare to achieve on big-budget films, but because of the smaller production and the advantage of having 90% of the film shot in a single set, this ended up being the most optimal process. In addition to making continuity easier to deal with, it also proved to be beneficial for the actors, who got to follow a natural progression based on the preceding events. Because of the relatively short production, director John Dowdle chose to have the cast and crew arrive on set in the early hours of the morning. The team then blocked out the scene they planned on shooting and rehearsed throughout the day to ensure that their timing was on point and to figure out the transition between master shots, wide shots, close-ups, and reverse shots before shooting 5-minute continuous takes in the afternoon. The frustration the entire team felt associated with needing to shoot 5-minute continuous takes without any mistakes understandably created a tense atmosphere on set. While it wasn't so clear during the production, the anxiety of wanting to get everything right and the reality of having to repeat the long takes because some of the actors forgot their lines, missed their cues, or because of unseen technical issues actually ended up appropriately registering on the screen. This tension inadvertently added to the overall sense of anxiety and lethargy that the characters were supposed to be feeling. To achieve the realistic depiction of the Armageddon virus and its effect on people, visual effects supervisor Robert Hall was hired to create prosthetics and design the look of the infected. To get the look just right, Hall and his team evaluated photos and videos of animals and people that had been infected with rabies and identified 3 stages that they wanted the infected to go through. The first phase involved a reduction in blood and oxygen supply, with the infected appearing slightly paler than usual. This was then complemented with psychological symptoms like confusion and a decline in problem-solving abilities. The second phase of the infection featured small physical changes being introduced, like increased saliva excretion leading to excessive foaming of the mouth, followed by bloodshot eyes and self-inflicted injuries. This, in addition to their rabid aggression, alluded to a breakdown in cognitive awareness. The third and final phase detailed an absolute deterioration of the physical and mental features of the infected, with decaying skin, loss of muscle density, and heightened aggression, as seen with the Thin Man portrayed at the end of the film by the incredible physical actor Doug Jones, who was explained as being Patient Zero. The way that each of the infected were filmed was also crucial to making them look as scary as possible. The director of photography, Ken Tseng, ensured that they had as little light on them as possible and that the other characters would walk into frame, distracting our field of view, with the cinematographer noting that the less we saw, the scarier the infected were. His ability to clearly capture the action in camera and adhere to the found footage style while not succumbing to the frenetic and blurry visual signature usually synonymous with that genre of filmmaking is a testament to his mastery of the craft. The few times that the image was unclear or out of focus was a deliberate choice to indicate that the cameraman was deeply affected by what he was recording. Much like the Spanish film Wreck, the film opens with Angela, a reporter, and her cameraman Scott working on a story about the local fire brigade in Los Angeles. Unfortunately for the duo, what begins as a stress-free night of reporting soon descends into a nightmare when Angela and Scott join a group of firefighters that were dispatched to a residence encountering problems. When dealing with such dark subject matter, it always helps to inject some lightness to act as a counterweight, and this helps prevent the film from sitting on the same dreary note. Angela and Scott's introduction to the fire department, its chief, and many of the firefighters serves precisely that purpose, lulling us into a false sense of security with their happy smiles, jokes, and good nature, before the film literally and figuratively sends them from a safe location up towards a spiral staircase of terror. While they spend a good portion of the start at the station, with Angela being introduced to the practices and traditions of the fire brigade, the scenes don't feel as though they're too long. A lot of this has to do with the fact that many of us have no experience with how fire stations operate, and we're more forgiving as every little thing from the eating quarters, sleeping schedules, and the firemen's poles are quite intriguing. Another reason the scenes don't drag on has a lot to do with the great acting and the voyeuristic shooting style that makes the camera feel as though it's both a character in the film and a doorway for the audience to experience the action.
This was used in the 20s and the 30s.
Oh my god. Did you get the hook, Scott? Did you see this?
It was used in the 20s and the 30s. They stopped using it around the 40s.
Hold it up a little high.
That's good, right?
Good. Yeah, that's great.
They replaced it with like a regular ladder that extends.
Yeah, and rope.
Since most of the budget had been spent on designing and building the elaborate apartment set, the Dowdall brothers opted to film at an actual firehouse. In fact, many of the firemen were real firefighters on call, going about their normal routines. Though this was a choice born out of desperation, it ended up facilitating the sense of realism they were hoping to capture, while also lending legitimacy to the voyeuristic feel of the picture. Once they get a full tour of the station and get to know Jake and George, an alarm goes off, sending Angela, Scott, Jake, and George to a domestic disturbance call in downtown LA. They soon arrive at the building and are greeted by the building manager Yuri, who explains that one of his tenants named Mrs. Espinosa had been screaming earlier and was now silent. In contrast to the bright and cheery fire station, the building they enter is dark, claustrophobic, and unnerving. Joined by two police officers, Angela, Scott, Jake, and George precariously tiptoe up the stairs and make it to Mrs. Espinosa's apartment, to find her standing in the living room foaming at the mouth. As they slowly move towards her, we see a brief glimpse of a dog running out that had an unnatural bark, hinting at the likelihood that he'd infected her. When they approach Espinosa, who is visibly distraught and in a state of shock, she makes a quick move towards them. The intensity and pace of the film quickly changes here, with the camera movements becoming slower and the frequency of cuts reduced to allow for more continuous takes, creating a sense of foreboding. Before they could figure out what was wrong with Mrs. Espinosa, she lunges at one of the officers and infects him with a bite before being subdued by George, further adding to the chaos. As the group head back downstairs to seek medical aid for the officer, they find that the building had been locked from the outside, and when they look back, they see George's body fall from the top floor and hit the ground with a thump as a result of being attacked by Espinosa. The pace then fervently increases, signaling the turbulent and unstable mindset of the characters. One of the best things about this film is that, unlike traditional horror films, there is absolutely no musical score to take us out of the reality of what is happening. The only thing we hear other than dialogue is sound effects, which increases the palpable dread and makes it impossible for us to relax once the action kicks into gear. What's interesting to note is that the function of Angela and Scott evolves throughout the film. Both of them start off reporting what is happening around them, but once they become a part of the story, the footage transforms from a news report to a found footage style documentary, with Angela and Scott also transmogrifying from passive objective observers to active subjective participants in the pandemonium. As they start to round up all the tenants and evaluate the situation, we come to realize that a few of them had begun showing mild symptoms despite not having been bitten. With all the main exits now blocked, Yuri leads the group through to the textile shop on the ground floor, but once they reach the windows and attempt to escape, they're met by armed officials who threaten to shoot them before sealing the windows shut. This is followed by the jamming of their phones, preventing them from contacting their families or the media. Angela then overhears Jake say the letters BNC while he speaks to his supervisors on an emergency line. When she confronts him, he reveals that it meant that they were dealing with a biological, nuclear, or chemical threat, hence the drastic quarantine measures that were being taken. To make matters worse, when they manage to get access to a television, they're shocked to find that the news was downplaying the events, with emergency services falsely claiming that all of the people had been evacuated from the building. One of the residents named Lawrence, who happened to be a vet, does his best to treat all the injured and sick folk. It's here where he comes to the revelation that based on their consistent symptoms of fever, excessive saliva excretion, delirium, and aggression, that they all appeared to be suffering from a virus akin to rabies. He goes on to explain that in animals, rabies would usually take a couple of months for symptoms to take hold, which is why he was so shocked and alarmed that this virus only took a few minutes before the infected became symptomatic. The group are also informed that there was virtually no cure and that the virus was 100% fatal. The CDC soon arrive and explain that a dog belonging to a family that lived in the building had been brought to a local vet and was found to be infected with a mutated form of rabies. With the dog quickly infecting the other animals there, the staff had traced it back to the apartment and contacted the CDC, leading to the rapid large-scale quarantine the residents now had to endure. As the residents began succumbing to the later stages of infection, the number of safe areas in the building started to dwindle, with most of the rooms and hallways now being filled with rabid residents hell-bent on spreading the Armageddon virus. We're soon left with only Angela, Scott, and Jake, who make it to Yuri's apartment and retrieve his keys to facilitate their plan of secretly escaping through the sewers. Just as they start to put their plan into action, Jake is bitten by Yuri, and the pair find themselves overwhelmed by the horde of infected people chasing them, forcing the duo to abandon their sewer escape and retreat to the penthouse. When they enter the apartment, they discover that a resident from Boston, who was a member of a doomsday group, had been cultivating a variant of the rabies virus that he and his group had stolen from a bioweapons lab. This dickhead would later appear in the horrible sequel, Quarantine 2 Terminal, which showed how the virus would eventually make its way out of the building and infect more of the LA population. Angela and Scott then stumble on many articles related to the cult and their efforts to bring about the end of the world, including one where a former member revealed that the cult had previously released the virus on a small tribe living on an island in the South Pacific that was quickly wiped out. The pair also find a tape recorder, but when they attempt to play it, all they hear is an unsettling and unintelligible low-pitched growl. In the director's commentary, Dowdle explained that this was a journal kept by the lead scientists of the cult, detailing their evil manifesto. Though he intended on playing this unaltered in the final scene, once they started editing the film, the team decided that the less information the viewers had, the scarier the ending would be. Before Angela and Scott could process the significance of their discovery, Scott is attacked and killed by a tall, thin, infected man, implied as being Patient Zero. Angela attempts to hide under a desk, but she too is attacked and dragged away, in the iconic shot that would go on to define the entire film. As I'd mentioned in my previous video on the Armageddon virus, I really enjoyed this film and had seen it before I saw Wreck, much like most of the Western world, but I have to admit that Wreck is the superior film with its original concept, stellar direction, superb acting, and disturbing religious undertones. Having said that, I think it's also important to consider that although Quarantine is an almost shot-for-shot remake, its commercial success helped put Wreck on the map and allowed its critical success to extend beyond the European market. Well, that's all for today, folks. A huge thanks to everyone who requested we explore Quarantine. Don't forget to hit subscribe and click the notification icon to stay up to date on all my content, and if there's anything else you'd like to request, please don't hesitate to ask. As always, it's been a pleasure. Niyat here with Film and Comics Explained. Thanks for stopping by.
She seems to be unable to swallow or speak. She has a fever, she's confused, she has some degree of paralysis and delirium. These are all rabies symptoms. Rabies takes months for symptoms to show. This is taking minutes. I mean, rabies, it never acts this fast.
How's it cured?
No, there's no cure.
People get shots in their stomach, don't they? I've heard about that.
That's before symptoms start showing. Once symptoms show, rabies is 100% fatal.